Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we are tackling a massive, incredibly pervasive question that honestly affects almost every single society on Earth. Are we actually living in a time of severe moral decline? And more importantly, in an era where everyone seems convinced that society is just falling apart, does it even make sense to prosecute corrupt, influential politicians? Or is it just a totally lost cause? We're going to look at the psychology behind our worldview, the dangerous political traps it creates, and the concrete steps required to actually cure our institutions. It is a really fascinating journey, so let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. It's a pretty universal feeling, isn't it? That overwhelming belief that our values are just decaying. I mean, if you look at decades of polling data from organizations like Gallup, a large, totally consistent majority of Americans report year after year that the nation's morals are bad and they're rapidly getting worse. And it's definitely not just a modern American phenomenon. It spans right across different cultures and political ideologies. But is this feeling actually based on reality, or is our collective mind just playing tricks on us?
Look, if you feel like things used to be better, your feelings are completely valid. In fact, humanity has felt this exact same way for literally millennia. Ancient Hindu cosmology describes the cycle of time ending in something called the Kali Yuga. It's an age of profound moral decay and spiritual ignorance. According to texts like the Srimad Bhagavata Mahapurana, this is an era characterized by wealth completely replacing virtue, where law and justice are determined purely by power, and where truthfulness and cleanliness just diminish day by day.
And we see this exact same thing mirrored in Western antiquity as well. The great Roman historian Livy explicitly complained about the process of moral decline facing his society thousands of years ago. People in the post-war era looked fondly back at the Victorians, and the Victorians? Well, they missed the good old days before the Industrial Revolution. This absolutely proves that the fear of a decaying society is a deeply ancient, built-in human anxiety. Every single generation thinks they are living in the ashes of a more righteous past.
But here is the massive, data-driven reveal. Researchers at Harvard University recently conducted an exhaustive review of hundreds of surveys. They looked at data spanning 60 nations over 70 years. And guess what? When they measured people's perception of morality, everyone said it was declining. But when they measured actual, everyday morality, using 107 surveys tracking millions of people on how they're treated daily, if they get help from strangers, if they face incivility, they found that everyday moral behavior has remained completely unbelievably stable. There is literally less than a 0.3% variation over decades. The decline is a total illusion.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why our brains get it so incredibly wrong. It's called the BEAM model, which stands for biased exposure and biased memory. It explains how our subjective perceptions of morality completely diverge from reality over time. You see, even though objective indicators of extreme immorality, like historic violence, have heavily decreased, our brains are essentially wired to trick us into believing the exact opposite when it comes to everyday human interactions.
It basically comes down to two psychological culprits working in tandem. First, negativity bias. We are constantly exposed to, and we focus heavily on, negative information today. That old media adage, if it bleeds, it leads, guarantees that we absorb the absolute worst of current human behavior. Second, memory bias. As time passes, the emotional impact of negative memories fades way faster than positive ones. You totally forget the everyday rudeness you experienced 20 years ago. So the negativity bias makes the present look like a moral wasteland, while the memory bias falsely makes the past look like a moral wonderland.
But, and here's the catch, this psychological illusion has massive real-world consequences, particularly in politics, because it breeds intense cynicism. Political scientists break this down into two types. First, there's elite cynicism, which is the belief that just current politicians and elites are corrupt, but ordinary people are generally good. And then there is the much more dangerous human nature cynicism. That is the ingrained belief that all human beings are fundamentally selfish and badly intentioned. Which brings us to a fascinating question. If actual everyday morality isn't declining, why on earth do our voting patterns constantly reflect a society that expects the absolute worst from its leaders? To really understand this, we need to look at a groundbreaking political science study on voter behavior conducted in Kenya. It examined how deep-seated cynicism completely rewires our democratic choices.
Well, the Kenyan study uncovered a highly counterintuitive paradox. You'd think that voters who hate corruption would flock to clean candidates, right? But voters with high human nature cynicism, those who believe everyone is selfish, actually end up supporting openly corrupt politicians.
Why? Because to a deeply cynical voter, a politician claiming to have a perfectly clean record is just viewed as a massive liar pandering for votes. They automatically assume the clean candidate is just hiding their true corrupt nature.
So, the crucial point here is that human nature's cynical voters engage in what researchers call negative selection. Because they literally don't believe any good types actually exist, they invest entirely in the accountability function of elections rather than the selection function. They purposefully choose an openly corrupt candidate. That way, when the politician inevitably delivers poor policies, the voters can easily and ruthlessly vote them out to punish them. It creates this endless, repeating cycle of high turnover just to keep the threat of sanctions alive.
And this isn't just an isolated incident. Data analyzing 11 Ibero-American countries shows that this pervasive mistrust severely weakens institutions. When citizens view authorities and institutions as weak or corrupt, the citizens themselves become more likely to endorse political moral laxity. They start to legitimize transgression and become way more tolerant of intrinsically dishonest attitudes. They just assume, hey, the system's broken. So bending the rules is just how the world works now.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of this explainer. If our feeling of moral decline is just a psychological illusion, but the political cynicism it generates is highly destructive and very real, does prosecuting corrupt, influential politicians actually make a difference? Or are voters so trapped in a cynical worldview that law enforcement just won't change anything at all?
Now, what's really interesting is that the research gives us a resounding yes, it matters. Data from the Fundación Francisco Manuel dos Santos highlights that setting the tone at the top is an absolute non-negotiable requirement to fight political corruption. When ethical leadership and strict accountability are highly visible at the highest levels, it acts as a bulwark against systemic decay. Protecting democratic institutions absolutely requires prosecuting those who breach the public trust, regardless of how much influence they have.
A legal review of corruption eradication in Indonesia makes this incredibly clear. Over in Indonesia, corruption is literally classified as an extraordinary crime because of its sheer power to damage the economy and democratic sovereignty. Institutions like the KPK, the Corruption Eradication Commission, were formed because strict, independent law enforcement is the only way to break the cycle. The review noted that subordinates routinely turn a blind eye and mimic corrupt behavior just out of fear or compliance with their higher-ups. If the people at the top aren't prosecuted, the entire bureaucracy just rots from the inside out.
Let's see how this builds when we look at how voters react to real, tangible accountability. When political parties, which are essentially private law entities, actively enforce norms, the public really notices. Experimental data shows that when parties self-regulate by disclosing financial statements, or, most importantly, severely sanctioning and expelling members accused of corruption, it directly restores citizens' trust. Voters actually reward tangible efforts to uphold ethical standards. This proves for sure that cynicism can be reversed.
To tie it all together, the idea that ordinary people are fundamentally losing their morals is, well, it's a psychological illusion. It's caused by our biased memory and our heavy, constant exposure to bad news. However, the political cynicism that this illusion creates is a profound threat. It leads voters to support bad candidates and tolerate utterly broken systems. Therefore, aggressively prosecuting corrupt, influential politicians isn't just about punishing a crime. It is the absolute prerequisite to breaking the psychological trap of cynicism and proving to the public that justice really does still exist.
So we are left with a massive choice regarding our institutions and our own psychology. Will we let the deeply ingrained ancient illusion of moral decay trap us in a self-fulfilling cycle of cynicism and bad leadership, or will we recognize our own biases, reject the urge to just give up on the system, and relentlessly demand the high-level accountability needed to build real trust? It all starts with understanding exactly how our minds work, and it ends with demanding much better from those in power. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep questioning what you think you know.